Thank you for tuning in today. I'm going to direct your attention to Isaiah chapter 7, 8, and 9, especially chapter 7 as we begin. And I want to have a discussion about this Immanuel that occurs in the text and who he might be in the New Testament context as well as the Old Testament context. If you know very much at all about Isaiah, you probably know Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, and how Matthew refers to this as a prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus. And hopefully nothing I say in the next few minutes is going to diminish that in the slightest. Clearly that is the way that we are supposed to read this text, the way that we were always supposed to read this text. The virgin conceiving is talking about a particular proof of the deity of Jesus, that he was born the Son of God, that he has a special role in God's plan, that he's going to be the Messiah, the Savior of the world. That's a topic well beyond the scope of our discussion here today. But as is generally the case with messianic prophecy in the Old Testament, there is a surface meaning and a deeper spiritual meaning, meaning for us as we read in hindsight what was going on back then, but also a meaning on the surface, a meaning for the prophet and for his contemporaries. And I'm going to suggest here today that this word Immanuel doesn't just refer to Jesus. There is also a message for King Ahaz, the king during this time, and also for the people of the day. And the message is not an entirely positive thing. The word Immanuel, of course, means God with us or God is with us, which generally speaking from a Christian perspective sounds like a good thing. I'm going to suggest to you in the Old Testament context that it's a terrifying kind of thing, and that having God with them was not only not intended to be a comfort, at least not entirely so, but was also intended to show that the events of the day that were going against the people of God were of God's own making, that God had chosen to oppose them, chosen to bring destruction upon them, and the events that transpire in fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy were intended to show, at least in part, that God was in fact among them, that God did not approve of what they were doing, and that being in the presence of an angry God should be an absolutely terrifying kind of thing. I'm going to begin by reading a section out of chapter 7, if you want to follow along with me, starting in verse number 10. The text says here, "Then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God, make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, Listen now, O house of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Immanuel. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse good and choose evil. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. The Lord will bring on you, on your people, and on your father's house such days as have never come, such as have never come since the day that Ephraim separated from Judah, the king of Assyria. In that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the remotest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They will all come and settle on the steep ravines, on the ledges of the cliffs, on all the thorn bushes, and all the watering places. In that day the Lord will shave with a razor hired from regions beyond the Euphrates, that is, with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the legs, and also remove the beard. Now in that day a man may keep alive a heifer and a pair of sheep, and because of the abundance of the milk produced, he will eat curds, for everyone that is left within the land will eat curds and honey. And it will come about in that day that every place where there used to be 1,000 vines valued at 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. People will come there with bows and arrows, because of all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for all the hills which used to be cultivated with the hoe, you will not go there for fear of briars and thorns, but they will become a place for pasturing oxen and for sheep to trample. Now, they'll give you a sense of what's going on in this chapter, and probably enough to realize that surely there is more to this than simply that Jesus is going to be born of a virgin. Most of this has no reference at all to that sort of thing, and it may raise some questions in your mind exactly what is going on. Well, a little bit of background first. Ahaz is the king of Judah in Jerusalem, the descendant of David, the rightful king, and his nation is being invaded by a cooperative effort between his northern brethren, the nation of Israel, and the nation of Aram or Syria. The Syrians or the Arameans and the Israelites, they've already attempted to invade Jerusalem and it didn't work out, but they are laying the groundwork for a future and more successful invasion. And he's panicking about this, and he's reached out to the nation of Assyria. Assyria is different from Syria. Assyria is the power of the day. They are the rising force, and Ahaz wants him on his side. And so he has made this alliance with them, including worshiping the idols of the Assyrians. Isaiah, of course, disapproves of this, and he is trying to get Ahaz to think twice about this. Put your trust in God instead of in these foreign powers. Ahaz is not inclined to listen to Isaiah. It seems like he's being somewhat polite about it, diplomatic about it. Isaiah is too important a person to offend, so I will not test the Lord. I don't want to put the Lord in that kind of position, is the way that he responds here. But Isaiah is incensed at this. He is offering Ahaz a blank check, essentially, and Ahaz has already made up his mind. Isaiah says, well, whether you want it or not, we're going to give you a sign. There's going to be a birth. A child is going to be born. And it becomes clear in chapter 8 and 9, especially chapter 8, that there is an actual child that is born, a child who is called Immanuel, by the way, in chapter 8. This child is going to be a prophecy. And it talks about him eating curds and honey and that sort of thing. This is a child of that day. He's also called Maher-shalal-Hashbaz in the early part of chapter 8. I hope for this child's sake that he was actually called Immanuel rather than Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, but be that as it may. Both of these names are prophetic names. Maher-shalal-Hashbaz is talking about swift is the prey, swift is the booty. The idea that this harm is going to come very, very quickly, very fast. Immanuel, of course, means God with us. The presence of God is going to be felt in this foreign invasion. And this young boy who's going to be born is going to be a living prophecy of this. Perhaps this is why the words in the ancient languages are somewhat vague as to whether this is what we would call a virgin, a woman who has not known a man, or simply a young woman. Clearly, it's intended to be both of these. Matthew leaves no question that Jesus was born of a woman who had not known a man, and that is implicit in the word virgin. But in the Isaiah context, I don't think that's necessarily the case. A young woman is going to have a baby. It seems like it's Isaiah's baby, by the way, by way of the prophetess. And this child is going to be a sign for the nation. It talks about him the way he's going to live, the way he's going to grow up. His life is going to be a timeline for the people of God. And it's a terrifying kind of thing. We're used to thinking of the idea of God being with us as being a positive thing. I certainly rejoice in the idea of God being with us. But if you are on the wrong side of God's wrath, if God does not approve of you, if God is bringing chastening, then the closer God is to you, the more terrifying these events get. And I think that is the main point that Ahaz is supposed to take away from this. It's easy to assume that he is being told here that God is protecting you, God is guiding you, God's going to get you through this. And we'll have a bit to say about that along the way as we go. But clearly in this context, Ahaz is intended to take serious warning from this. The text talks about the boy eating curds and honey in short order, and there's a good bit of debate about what that means. It seems pretty clear to me that as the term comes up a little bit later on, that it's talking about siege rations. Historically, we know from the book of Isaiah here later on, and also from 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, that Assyria is going to invade in the days of Hezekiah ultimately and lay ravage to the nation. It's going to be a disaster. Virtually all of the nation is going to fall. Jerusalem is going to be one of, if not the only part of the nation that does not fall. And all they're going to have to eat is curds and honey. There's not going to be any farming going on. There's no produce from the land. You may have a little bit of livestock that's holed up in the house with you because you're not allowed to go out into the country because that's where the Assyrians are. That's where the enemy is. And so you eat whatever you're able to produce from your livestock, from a small, a couple of animals, maybe some honey you've been able to harvest as well. That's all you have to eat. And that's what this young boy is going to be eating. That's all that he's going to be eating. That's all the nation is going to be eating. There is horrible humiliation coming here. I don't know how you feel about hair on men, But in the days of Ahaz and the days of Isaiah, you showed yourself to be a man by growing hair, by growing facial hair and body hair, and being shaved. There's other passages where this comes up as well. In David's day, some people are taken captive, half their beard is shaved off. It's an embarrassment. It's some humiliation here. In chapter 23, verse number 23, rather, where it talks about $1,000 vineyards essentially are going to be reduced to nothing. The point is that the Assyrians are going to be camped out there, and anything that is growing is going to die. They're going to kill everything. They're going to chop down all the trees. They're going to destroy all the vineyards. That's what happens in siege conditions. This is coming in short order. The verse number 20 there, in that day the Lord will shave the razor hired from regions beyond the Euphrates, the hair of the head, the hair of the legs, it will remove the beard. This is going to be the worst thing that the nation of Judah has ever experienced. And the text says so in so many words. This is of Ahaz's choosing. And that's a very important point here. It's coming at the hands of the Assyrians. The Assyrians are bringing this upon Ahaz because Ahaz has locked the nation's fate into Assyria. And Isaiah says, basically, you want it, you got it. You want to put your trust in Assyria, we're going to see what Assyria can do for you here. And you see this fleshing out a little bit in chapter 8 as this boy is born into the land. And verse number 5 and following in chapter 8, again, the Lord spoke to me further, saying, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing rivers of Shiloah, and rejoice and reason in the son of Remaliah. That's these two foreign kings that they were afraid of. Now, therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise up over its channels and go over its banks. Then it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through. It will reach even to the neck, and spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Immanuel. And there that name is again. This young boy is going to see this. He's going to live to see it. Whether you call him Immanuel or Maher-Shalal Hashbaz, he stands for the entire nation. And the flooding imagery is powerful. When you see in the Old Testament flooding imagery, you can't help thinking about Noah and Noah's day. The same kind of thing is happening, not to the same degree, obviously. Jerusalem is at high elevation, so there's a little bit of literal terminology going on there. But the flood here is the army. The flood is this foreign power. Assyria is going to come in and creep in and destroy everything that it touches. And it's like you're in floodwaters, and the water goes up and up all the way up to your neck. It feels like you're about to die. This is what it means to be in the presence of God. It's not Assyria that's doing this. It's God who is doing this. And as this nation starts falling apart, as these horrible things start happening, even in Ahaz's day, the people who should be taking warning against this are going to themselves just rebel even more. And if you remember back in chapter 6 of Isaiah, God told Isaiah, this is what's going to happen. He says, who's going to send out the message? Isaiah raises his hand. Here am I, send me. And God says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go out there and preach this message of doom and destruction and horror. People are going to hate what you have to say. And Isaiah says, how long do I have to do this? And he says, until there's nothing left. People are going to reject what you have to say. Ahaz is going to reject what you have to say. This is a bit before he meets Ahaz, of course, before Ahaz becomes king. But Ahaz is maybe the worst example of what is generally going on, largely going on. Not everybody is going to be Hezekiah. Not everyone is going to listen to what Isaiah has to say. Far more often than we would like to think, it's exactly the opposite. You skip down to chapter 8 and verse number 14. Or verse 13 say, it is the Lord of hosts whom you shall regard as holy, and he will be your fear, and he shall be your dread. Then he shall become a sanctuary, but to the houses of Israel a stone to strike, and the rock to stumble over, and a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, maybe you're a little bit ahead of me on this and recognize that as a passage that is quoted a couple of times in the New Testament, referring to Jesus. And again, the same kind of symbolism is going on here, that there is a rock of security, a blessing from God that is being given and being horribly, horribly misunderstood, and in fact seen as a rock of offense, a stone of stumbling. Jesus is going to cause certain people, anyway, to rebel even more against the people, against the will of God. God sends Jesus into the world to save the world, and the people who are mired in darkness, as we read in chapter 3 of John, The people who have loved the darkness hate the light. They're going to hate Jesus. They're going to wind up killing Jesus because of this. The same thing is going on in Isaiah's day. There is going to be this message that has the potential for pulling people out of this situation, for saving them. More on that in a second. But for the majority of the people of this day, they are simply going to rebel even more. I find it interesting as the text goes on, verse number 19 of chapter 8, when they say to you, consult the mediums and the spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and the testimony. If they do not speak according to the word, it is because they have no dawn. They will pass through the land hard-pressed and famished, and it will turn out that when they are hungry, they will be enraged and curse their king and their God as they face upward. Then they will look to the earth and behold disaster and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be driven away into darkness. As things get worse and worse, instead of being turned to repentance, as had been the case in the time of the judges and in other times in Israel's history, they are going to rebel that much more. They're going to lash out at God. The problem is not that we weren't serving God. The problem is we're serving God too much. That this is not a God that we want to be associated with. And people today will do the same thing. People who claim to honor God in some general sort of sense, bad things happen and they lash out against God. They use bad times in this world, not as opportunities for chastening, for learning, for repentance, but rather to turn them against the God who made them. This is a different version of what happens in Moses' day when he goes and preaches to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh hardens his heart against the preaching of the gospel, this message of salvation. That's what many wicked people do. Thankfully, some wicked people will turn in this day. Even King Ahab was able to return when he heard a message of condemnation. I'm not sure exactly how long-term his commitment to God was. Seems like it was rather short-term, but at any rate, we see after the incident in Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings chapter 21, that Ahab was genuinely sorry, and God heard his prayer and forgave him of what he had done. These bad times, these curses placed by Isaiah and other preachers, they may have a positive effect, but far too often it has exactly the opposite effect. Ahaz is emboldened in his rebellion. Other rebels are emboldened as well. And the more they see the work of God, the more they see the condemnation of God, the punishment of God, the consequences of rebelling against God, the more emboldened they are to continue their rebellion, to get worse and worse. And again, going to the New Testament, that's going to be what people do with regard to Jesus. The more they're exposed to him, the more they hate him, the more they want to kill him, and eventually, of course, did kill him. The same thing happens today. What we need to do is overcome that. We need to be able to see the presence of God, especially and particularly in these bad times. If we see God bringing a curse upon the land, if we see God having consequences in our own personal lives because of some kind of sin that we have committed, we use that opportunity to turn to him, to not be terrified, but rather to be moved to repentance. And that's what I'd like to talk about secondly, before we close up, a little bit of positivity with regard to this. As terrifying and legitimately terrifying as it should be to be in the presence of an angry God, it's not all bad either. God with us ultimately, regardless of what we've been saying the last 10, 15 minutes, can be and should be a good thing. And even in this situation, even as Assyria is pounding at the door, even as the nation seems like it's going to be absolutely and completely destroyed, just like one nation after another had in front of the Assyrian hordes, there is still hope. There is still opportunity for joy. God is still with his people in a positive sense, not just in a negative sense. Back to chapter 7 again in verse number 21 and 22. A man may keep alive a heifer and a pair of sheep, and because of the abundance of the milk produced, he will eat curds for everyone that is left within the land to eat curds and honey. If all you have to eat is whatever your livestock might be able to produce for you as they live downstairs in your shed, your animal shed, essentially. If that's all you have, you want those animals to produce as much as they possibly can. And can one cow, can two sheep possibly produce enough food for your entire family? God says yes. This may not be the way you want to live, but that small source of food is going to produce a tremendous amount of food. You will be able to sustain yourself through all of this. God will sustain you like he gave manna in the wilderness. Maybe not the way that they were used to being fed or the way they wanted to be fed, the way they would have chosen, all things being equal, the way they had eaten in times past. But they were still blessed by God, and hopefully they were able to see this food of privation, this food of desperation, as a blessing from God. That's what it's going to be here. Yes, you're going to be isolated. You're not going to be able to eat from your land. You're not going to be able to eat your produce, but you will eat, and you will eat enough, God says. You will be provided. Back in chapter 8 and verse 13, we read this earlier, that God is going to provide a sanctuary for his people. Yes, most people are going to stumble over this, but how many times in the Old Testament is God described as being a rock, a source of strength, a source of permanence? Water comes from the rock a couple of times in the wilderness wanderings. Rocks are set up to demonstrate God's presence at various times during the Canaan conquest. And on we can go, in the Psalms especially. So many times he places us in the cleft of the rock, like Moses was there in the cleft of the rock, like Elijah was there in the cleft of the rock, to experience the power and the presence of God and be protected from it, be protected from God himself. As his righteous indignation comes before us, we can also be protected from the wrath of God. Isaiah and his contemporaries were going to be protected. God was angry, absolutely, and bad things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen to good people as far as that goes. But that doesn't mean that God has forgotten about the righteous ones. He hasn't forgotten about Isaiah. When Hezekiah comes along, he's not going to forget about Hezekiah. And he doesn't forget about us either. As I don't know what your position is with regard to God's role in the climate of the world that we're surrounded by. It seems sometimes that things just get worse and worse, that our world is coming apart at the seams. Maybe it is. Maybe it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. Maybe it never will get better. And we as the people of God can be moved to despair. We can cry out to God, why are we going through all of this? And maybe this is the answer. We're going through this so that we can see the hand of God sheltering us, protecting us, being with us in these difficult times. He will provide that rock for us. He will provide that sanctuary for us, that safety, if only taking us to heaven after this life is over. We don't want to minimize that in the slightest. But even in this life, there is still blessing, there is still comfort, there is still consolation from the hand of God, no matter how many bad things may get in the world, and no matter how bad things may get with us. God is still with us, and relief is going to come to us. And the way it comes is remarkable. We've been touching on the Jesus story from time to time, but the Jesus story comes in with a vengeance, as it were, in chapter 9. After all these horrible things have been going on, we talked about them looking to the earth and behold darkness, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, driven away into darkness. And this isn't just the rebellion of the people in Ahaz's day. This is the rebellion of the people in general. The people have shown themselves to be unworthy of God and his grace and his love. And just as it seems like it might be time to write the nation entirely off, God brings deliverance. And I don't doubt that this is primarily, if not exclusively, talking about Jesus. And the way it comes is so remarkable. Remember the land of the 10 tribes that had been given over to rebellion, that had been hauled off into Assyrian bondage by the time Hezekiah comes along. They are not long for this world in the days of Ahaz. 65 years, he's told in chapter 7, this problem is going to be gone. Assyria is going to erase this nation from the map, so don't worry about them. But look what happens in verse number 1 in chapter 9. There will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, that is the northern tribes, with contempt. But later on, he will make it glorious by the way of the sea on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. You shall multiply the nation. You shall increase their gladness. They will be glad in your presence, as with the gladness of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you will break the yoke of their burden and the staff on their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, as at the battle of Midian. For every boot of the booted warrior in the battle tumult and cloak rolled in blood will be burning fuel for the fire. For a child will be born to us, another child, he says. A son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and the name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end of the increase of the government or of his peace. On the throne of David and of his kingdom, he will establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. Now, perhaps in some small way, a ruler like Josiah rather, is going to come along and fulfill this prophecy that great things are coming in the land of the people if you'll just be patient. But especially as this is referred to as coming from the land of Galilee, the Gentiles. The New Testament references that refer to this passage. This is talking about Jesus from Galilee, of all places, the place where the problem is coming. This is where the solution is going to come. The Lord Jesus Christ is going to come from Nazareth, a laughing stock among laughing stocks. And he is going to provide this government, this leadership, this justice that had been so lacking among the people of God all this time. And we continue to be the beneficiary of this blessing, that Jesus comes and establishes his government. He reigns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in a way that even David himself never could. He is a spiritual monarch, a perfect monarch, one whose judgment is inscrutable. And Isaiah is going to talk a lot about this. He already has to a certain degree in chapter 2, but especially as these servant songs progress in chapter 42 and chapter 49, and chapter 53 certainly. We see this coming king who is going to provide real relief from the difficulties, the hardships, the pain, the chastening of God. We're going to see the end of this story. God is going to get us to the end. If we'll have enough faith, if we will endure, if we will wait for him to accomplish his purposes, we will be able to see that there was always a plan here. And that's where we are as the people of God, looking at it in hindsight, seeing what God has already done for us in the people, among the people of God. Skip ahead a little bit to chapter 10, verse number 33 and following, and look at how God is going to do these wonderful things for us. More messianic passages. Behold, the Lord, the God of hosts, will lop off the boughs with a terrible crash. This is talking about the destruction of this horrible force in Assyria. Those who are tall in stature will be cut down, and those who are lofty will be abased. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with an iron axe, and Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. Then a shoot, verse number 1 of chapter 11, will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth, and will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. And with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Also righteousness will be left about his loins, the belt around his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. And on it goes there in chapter 11 to talk about the greatness of this one king who could only come in the aftermath of destruction. The reason that he is such a remarkable shoot is the reason he's able to come up in this way is because God has cleared out the way. He has allowed the world to go fallow, as it were. He's allowed wickedness to prosper. He's allowed this horrible forest to arise where the people of God should have been. And when the time comes, he's going to clear it out. And don't get hung up on timelines here. That's not the point. He's not saying that Jesus is going to come when the Assyrians are gone. That's not the point. But rather that when the Assyrians and the Babylonians and all of these human empires have had their day, Daniel chapter 2 talks about that, Daniel chapter 7 as well. God is going to show the fallacy of this way. He's going to clear them all out, bring them to destruction. And in this aftermath, he's going to bring up this shoot, this small little branch, the seedling, in the wake of all this human destruction. And this is where greatness is going to be. This is where the true king is going to survive. He is going to accomplish great things. He's not going to be like these kings that you saw in Assyria or Babylon. He's not even going to be like the kings of Judah. He's going to be great and magnificent in his judgment, in his wisdom, and especially as he lives his life in the fear of the Lord. Everything that he does is going to be governed by the will of his heavenly Father. And that is the kingdom that we have the opportunity to be participants in right now. Yes, God being among us was a terrifying thing, and we should see it that way. But it's not all terrifying. And ultimately, it is glorious because God is going to take residence in human form in a way that he had never had before. Jesus Christ, who was the fullness of deity in bodily form, Colossians 2 verse 9 tells us that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John 1 verse 14. This personification of holiness and righteousness and justice comes into the world and shows us what we can do to truly live in the presence of God. Literally, for 30-something years, we were able to live in the presence of God. And now we, as God's people, we are able to live through Jesus Christ in a harmonious fashion in this grand and glorious kingdom that has been brought about for our benefit. And ultimately, of course, have an even deeper fellowship that we can not just have God living with us, we can be living with God. And Jesus makes that possible also. So let's not get so distraught over the world's circumstances so as to think that God is not with us anymore, nor let us get so caught up in our blessings and the positive aspects of this life to think that God is not going to punish evil. God is with his people. God is among the world. The kingdom is the Lord's. He rules over the nations. And the more we see him as active in the affairs of mankind, in the kingdoms of mankind, the more we give him the glory for the creation itself, for the sustenance of the universe, for his continued blessings upon us, for our daily bread and everything else that we receive from him. And the more we can trust in him, that he is in fact watching over us, that he does love us, that he has provided for us, especially in the person of Jesus Christ. But really every single day that we live in his service, we are blessed beyond measure. It is an amazing thing, this concept of Immanuel. And let's make sure that we live lives that will glorify God so that we can rejoice in the presence of God and rejoice in the presence of Jesus Christ in our lives and not be caught up in the righteous anger of God that is every bit as real as his love. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. Let's make sure that we do not do that. Let's embrace the love and the grace and the mercy that is available through him because God is, in fact, with us because of Immanuel. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that this has been a blessing to you. I hope you continue to study the book of Isaiah and other passages to draw closer to God and to his will for your life. Thank you very much. God bless.